My guest this week is Professor Lawrence Krauss. Lawrence is a theoretical physicist, lecturer, and he is also an author of many books, including A Universe from Nothing, The Greatest Story Ever Told So Far, and also his most recent book, The Physics of Climate Change. He has been a researcher at Harvard University, as well as a professor at Yale, Case Western Reserve, Arizona State University, and Australian National and New College Humanities in London. His current role is as the president of the Origins Project Foundation and the host of the Origins podcast. Lawrence, welcome to STEM with Mr. N.
Well, it's nice to be with you virtually.
It's a pleasure to have a chance to talk to you. So can we start off just finding out a bit about what the Origins Project Foundation involves and the Origins podcast?
Well, both of them are really motivated by the same thing, that science is a vital part of our culture. The process of science and the activities and the discoveries of science are among the most exciting intellectual developments that humanity has been involved in. And as such, they should be more widely appreciated and understood. And so the idea is to connect science and culture by bringing together the leaders in science and culture together to talk about these issues. But also not just because those ideas are fascinating and really a part of what of our civilization, but also because if we want to address the problems and challenges of the 21st century, we're going to need to have the tools that science provides, and so we want to address those. We want to help people be better prepared to address those challenges, and so our podcast discussions and public events and travel programs are designed to allow people to have access to the people who can help them.
It's a great way that now that you've come through all this time as a professor and researcher to give sort of back to the community with this science communication, which I know has been a big part of your career anyway. But if we go back in the past, what first got you interested in the STEM subjects?
Well, it's one of the reasons I do what I do. I got interested. Well, there are two things that got me interested in science, I suppose. Well, it's hard to psychoanalyze it, but things that I remember include the fact I remember reading a book about Galileo for school when I was in grade 5 or 6, I think, and that had a big impact because he became kind of a hero. In particular, I thought of sort of scientists as heroes, as struggling against misunderstanding and superstition and so in that sense, I've come to realize that Galileo was a rare case, but still, it got me interested. My mother also wanted me to be a doctor at the time and told me that doctors were scientists, and so since I was interested in being a doctor, I got interested in science. And there was also a neighboring kid, and his father was an engineer. And also, I would say the encouragement of teachers. I think that had a role as well. But the Galileo book led to, the decision to become a scientist took a while. I didn't really know what it was. Neither of my parents finished high school, but it was reading books by scientists. I mean, the Galileo book was about a scientist, but then reading books by Albert Einstein and Sir James Jeans and George Gamow and eventually Richard Feynman and others really had an impact. And that's one of the reasons I've written. I mean, having had the opportunity, it wasn't necessarily a path I planned, but being fortunate enough to have achieved whatever I have done that allowed me to have a public voice. It was really to pay back the favor that I've been given that really turned me on to science. And one of the greatest joys I get is getting emails from people, old and young, who say that my books or my lectures or other things have turned them on to science, either a career or just to understand it. I get letters from young people, and I'm old enough to get letters from old people who told me they read me when they were young, and that's wonderful because it really returns the favor. It was really that, as much as anything else, that got me interested in science, the reading books by scientists.
And I can testify to the impact that your books have been a fan and a reader of your books as well, and watching things on YouTube. So I've heard there about how reading got you interested in science, but what particularly led you towards physics and then theoretical physics?
Well, that's a good question. Again, I mean, early on, I was interested in what we would call neuroscience when I was a kid, because I thought I might become a brain surgeon. I mean, clearly the brain was fascinating to me, but I think following Galileo and the others that I read, it became clear to me what really fascinated me were the fundamental questions about nature, the big questions, the questions of how do we get here, how did the universe evolve, are we alone in the universe, and what are the fundamental laws that govern the nature of reality, and that seemed to me the sexiest part of science, and it certainly was the area that the books were written about. I still think they get the most attention from the public because those questions are questions that everyone asks. Doesn't mean the other areas of science aren't important or interesting. In fact, they are fascinating. But it's also something about being able to talk about the nature of space and time and grabs people. And but it certainly grabbed me. And so for me, it was fundamental physics that I decided I had to do, and it was theoretical physics, which, in retrospect, I've come to appreciate experiment a lot more, and kind of wish I'd gotten more involved in experiment, perhaps. But again, the all the attention was to theoretical physicists like Einstein and the others, and I was I was good at mathematics, and mathematics appealed to me. In fact, I did a degree in mathematics as well as one in physics, and so I think that those are the questions that got me, and over time, I wish there was more areas I knew about. One of the reasons I love writing books is I learn a lot of things in the process, and it gives me the discipline to learn some areas that I wish I knew more about. And certainly, modern biology and genetics is a fascinating area right now, which I think is really an area to learn about. And to some extent, there's been developments in consciousness issues that are fascinating. But still, I guess my heart always goes back to the basic questions of trying to understand. Being the first one, I mean, that somehow, for me, the appeal of being the first one to understand something fundamental about the world was a goal that drove me, I guess. And one or two times in my life, I've sort of been there, I think, and that's very satisfying.
Well, I certainly first became aware of you when you're talking about goals to try and understand the fundamentals of the universe. The first one of your books that I came across was A Universe from Nothing, which is obviously all about trying to explain how we got here. I don't think you can get any more fundamental than how did we get all of this.
Yeah, well, I think that book certainly became a big bestseller, and it grabbed people for a variety of reasons, I think. But yeah, the purpose was really to show the amazing revolutions that have taken place in the last 50 or 60 years in our understanding of the universe, allowing us to address questions that I never thought we'd be able to address when I was a graduate student. And it was, the reaction has been very, well, to some extent, surprised me. It's beautiful. It's dutifully short, which I think is important for science books, especially physics books, because people are intimidated by physics. So I try to make my books as short as I can make them without being, I want to have in each of my books, I don't want to appeal to authorities. I want to give the arguments, but I don't want to be any longer than necessary.
And one of your other books, which is one that I don't have behind me, but it was the science of Star Trek. Were you interested in sci-fi already before you started pursuing science, or did that come later as you started looking at science, you got more interested in sci-fi?
Well, it's kind of a chicken and egg argument. I've thought about it. I mean, I wrote the book based on a discussion with my editor at the time, whose daughter was a Trekker. And I remember me having a lunch meeting in New York City, and at the time I taught at Yale, and I kind of laughed when she said, "Oh, the physics Star Trek," and I laughed. And then on the train back to New Haven, I started to think about, well, how would I make a transporter, and how would I do? And it began to capture me, and it was daunting though to just say, "Oh, look, I watched Star Trek when I was a kid, but I watched everything. I watched a tremendous amount of TV, and I liked science fiction too." But to ask the question, is it science fiction that spurred my interest in science or vice versa? I really can't answer. I tend to think it was my interest in science that spurred my interest in science fiction, but they certainly deal with similar questions, so it's not surprising that I would have been interested. But I was interested in a lot of things, and it wasn't as if science fiction was the center of my life. And in fact, it was daunting to even think of writing the physics of Star Trek, because at the time I wasn't really an expert. I watched all the episodes of the original series growing up, but that's just because I watched a lot. And I had to catch up by watching all the episodes of the other series in preparation for writing the book, which was interesting at times. And And then, you know, and obviously because of that and the success of that book, I've spent a lot of time thinking about science fiction and its role in relation to science, certainly talking about it because I get asked a lot about it. And you know, I think Stephen Hawking's forward for that book was well, I thanked him for it immensely. He was a friend, but was spot on in the sense that science fiction helps spur the imagination. And that, like science, both of them are the same. The difference is that science is much more disciplined in the sense that in science fiction you can spur the imagination by imagining anything and not having to prove it or test it, and it's a lot easier. But also, I would argue, and this is really important, that the imagination of nature is much greater than the imagination of human beings. Science fiction writers usually miss all the important developments because if they didn't, there would be discoveries, right? And I mean, there's a few times that science fiction has anticipated what's going to happen, but most of the big things it's missed because we didn't have any idea about it. It's nature that's driven us to understand and discover new things.
So obviously we've spoken there a lot about your research into space and the physics of space, and then even Star Trek is still space themed. But your most recent book is The Physics of Climate Change. What led you with this book to move away from looking at and writing about space to looking at the physics of climate change?
Well, I've tried a number of books, by the way, look quite broadly. My book, Adam, which is a book that isn't in the back of your behind you, I see, but it's still one of my favorite books. The story of Adam from the beginning of the universe to the end. And as a result, I had to learn biochemistry, molecular biology, geology, because it's an atom that goes through the earth at some point in your body. And so it's fun for me to learn new things. But the climate change book, there are a number of reasons I wrote it. And you know, circumstances led me to do that. First, I've been tutored for over a dozen years in some sense in climate change, which is clearly an important issue. But in my role as, which I don't think, I can't remember if you mentioned it, I don't think so, but I was chairman of the board of sponsors of the Bolton Atomic Scientists for almost a dozen years. And that's the doomsday clock, as which you may have heard of. And in that role, we would, every year we'd have a symposium. We're looking at the major challenges and issues facing humanity. And when I became chair of the board, we changed things. So it was originally nuclear weapons. Bolton's been around since it was the first chairman of the board of the sponsors were Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer. I felt quite honored to be in that position later on. And nuclear weapons were clearly the reason that had been developed, informing the public of the danger of nuclear weapons. And it's still, in my mind, the number one threat facing humanity. But we enlarged it to consider other possible large-scale existential threats, and climate change became one of them. So in each of those years, I hear from people, and I got to know people as colleagues on the board, and I learned a lot. And then I led through the Origins Project Foundation. I led a travel adventure to the Mekong Delta in Vietnam and Cambodia, and I lectured on climate change, and for the most part, and that of course required me to learn some more things as well. But it also made it much more personal because, as I described in the book, the Mekong Delta is kind of a perfect storm for climate change. One can talk vaguely and generally about effects that are going to happen over the course of a century or more, but there are going to be real and serious impacts there and in other places like it. And coming to get to know and love the people of that region and see the struggles that they've had, it really brought it home personally to me. But I still at that time had no intention of writing a book on the subject. But then when the pandemic hit, all of my other commitments were canceled. I used to travel a tremendous amount, and I was not traveling, and I wasn't a first responder, and I tried to think of what could I do that might be useful. And I thought, well, maybe I can do something useful for people in one of two ways. With my podcast, I created a series of daily videos called 5-Minute Physics for students and teachers.
Yeah, I've watched them. They were great. I really enjoyed them, especially somebody who's not a physicist.
I thought that's something I can do during the pandemic that is maybe of some use. But at the same time, I thought, hey, I could maybe write a book on the physics of climate change as a useful thing and take advantage of this pandemic to do something. And I'd never done anything like that before. I wrote the book. I hadn't had any contract. The first time I had no contract to write a book. And because of the usually I've written books with having 1 or 2 or 3 day jobs at the same time. And usually I write them in the middle of the night, to tell you the truth. And here I could write a book and spend 15 to 18 hours a day on it. And I wrote that book in, and it's hard for me to believe it now, in 8 or 10 weeks. Where it's never taken me less than a year to write a book. But it was really the pandemic and the opportunity to do something for people and feeling the time was right. And in particular, seeing that this issue in the public had become infused with emotion and politics. And I wanted to write a book, having met people who were resistant to the notion that the climate is changing due to human industrial activity. Most of that resistance comes from their concern about the fact that people are going to demand policies that are going to infringe on what they view as their rights. And that turns them off immediately. They decide they don't buy it. And so I want to write a book with no policy discussion, just the science, so that people could at least internalize that and then decide what they thought was useful in terms of policies to try and break through those barriers. And I had several friends who were able, had felt that way, and I was very pleased when they read it. They said this was the book that they've been looking for. So in any case, it was a labor of love, like a number of my books, and the fact that I'm not a climate scientist, one might think would preclude my writing, but I thought it was even more important because I wasn't climate scientist. Because if I, as a scientist who writes about science, can't understand the basics of climate change, then how can we expect the public to have an informed discussion? And the really important thing is, the science is very basic, as I like to say. And the reason the book is called The Physics of Climate Change, well, that may sound intimidating, and I realize it sounds for some people like a textbook, but I didn't care. It was a takeoff of the physics of Star Trek, because, I tried to take climate change isn't rocket science.
One of the things that I really liked about the book, which you have covered there, was the fact that you did focus on the science on what is usually a very emotive subject for people, which leads me on to one of the other questions I wanted to ask you about. So a lot of people, when they're looking into things like climate change, they go online and they Google things to see what information they can find. But there's a lot of misinformation out there as well on climate change. There's flat earthers, there's anti-vax. Have you got any advice for how people, and particularly children and young people who might be looking up, can spot things that aren't right, or ways that they can tell that what they're reading is accurate, or even where they can find the most accurate information?
Well, look, I mean, that's a really important question, and I've spent a lot of time talking about it in a variety of contexts, because I think that that's the real neat goal. That should really be the goal of education in the 21st century, is to how to teach kids to separate the wheat from the chaff, because there's so much information on this thing, but so much misinformation, that people have to learn the tools to separate them. And the tools are really the tools of science, right? Which is skeptical inquiry, testing, looking at the ideas, comparing them to evidence of experiment, and seeing if they pan out, then retesting them. And that's what you have to do on the internet. If you read something that appeals to you, the first thing you should ask is, well, it may appeal to me, but is it right? And if it's right, and there are ways to think about it. First of all, look at other sources. Ask yourself the question, hey, this seems interesting, but does it disagree with the evidence of what I know already about the world? If it does, it's probably wrong. And one of my favorite lines, which I don't think I put in this book, but comes from a publisher of the New York Times, actually comes from earlier than that, was where he said, I like to keep an open mind, but not so open that my brains fall out. and that's what's important. I think we all have to echo chambers. We all tend to want to believe things, and we should realize we want to believe things. In fact, science is based on the fact that scientists themselves are human and have biases, and the tools of science help you overcome that. So constant questioning. And you can, as over time, you can begin to learn what sources are reliable and what aren't by testing them against the evidence of reality. And so you begin to build up a set of reliable sources. But even those, of course, are always subject to question. And if you read something that seems like it's not quite right to you, you shouldn't just buy it. You should question it. And that means look for more information elsewhere on the web, or talk to others, or reach out to experts. So it's really just internalizing the scientific process itself, which is all the point of teaching science, as far as I can see. It's not so much the facts of science, which may be fascinating, but teaching people how to use that scientific method, the process of science in their lives, to help address problems and to help adjudicate disputes, even, which science does very well, by allowing all sides to make their case, and then the cases that don't agree with evidence or don't make useful predictions are just thrown by the wayside, whether you like it or not, or whether it seems mean-spirited or not. It's just the way it is. So you're right. I think it's a major problem. The fact that misinformation right now gets as much play as information, and we have to all work at that. I mean, personally work at it, and schools need to teach kids those techniques.
One of the favourite quotes that I've heard from you was that if the only tool you've got is a hammer, everything else looks like a nail because you've only got the one way to approach it.
Yeah.
But I've noticed, just even with the pupils that I teach, what you're saying there about the creative thinking that comes within science when it's applied to other aspects, it really can help draw out the truth. So that was
science is creative. It's not, people tend to think art is creative and science isn't. And that's just, I remember I was at an event with a friend of mine, Alan Alda, is an actor, but also quite interested in science. He got up at that event and said something like, art, and he's an actor, art and drama require great precision and science requires great creativity. And it was just a wonderful turn on things, because people tend to think the opposite. And the point is, they all fields of human activity require both. And science and the creativity, science relies on creativity. It also requires on questioning and stumbling blocks and lots of things. But that's really common to the human experience in general.
So that's a good lead on now to talking about that creativity and getting involved in STEM. Have you got any advice for children or young people who are interested in STEM just now, but not sure how they can nurture it or continue to pursue it going forward?
Well, I don't have general advice. I hate to give advice in general, but there's a lot of tools. Go there. The internet has lots of wonderful, wonderful tools to learn about science. You can listen to my 5-minute physics videos, but there's lots of others. And books and public books. One reason I write is so people can, get turned on about that. And then, go to your local museum and approach people at your local university. It will usually thrilled when members of the public ask, are showing interest, and talk to your friends and plan clubs to look into this, do excursions to interesting locations. Lots of ways to learn. But what's amazing to me is that children, all people now do have an opportunity, in spite of the flaws of the internet. People have access to information and to opportunities that were unheard of when I was a young person. So young people can get things immediately that were just unheard of. And so take advantage of the wonderful world around you and use the tools to explore it. And the internet is one big part of it. But go out there and see the experiments yourself and talk to the people involved as well.
And I'll put links in the description to the Origins Project Foundation, the Origins podcast, and to the 5 minutes physics video, so that people can find them easily. Because I've enjoyed listening to them and watching the videos as well. So that brings us to an end. It's been a fascinating chat with you, Professor Krauss. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks. I enjoyed the questions. It was nice to have a discussion and keep up the good work at your end.